Good morning guys, and welcome to episode 2 of Reptile Misconceptions at Peculiar Pets. This video was a bit last minute. I wasn't going to do this, but since having Elsie, the Savannah monitor, in the shop, it has become quite obvious that most of what people think these animals need is actually wrong. So we've decided to do a video on Savannah monitor misconceptions, basically. So kind of the biggest thing that we see with captive monitors of pretty much every species is obesity, but there's kind of none more affected by it than Savannah monitors. Now there is a very old misconception that monitors can all just be fed on rats and because it's a complete meal it must be good for them. Unfortunately that isn't the case with the Bosc or Savannah monitor. Bosc monitors have evolved to eat insects, and pretty much only insects, with the occasional agama egg and that kind of thing along the way. It's been found through Daniel Bennett's wild research that these animals are almost completely insectivorous, and when they're not provided that in captivity we see a lot of instances of liver damage, obesity, and it is really shortening their captive lifespan. The Savannah monitor's history in captivity is quite dark. They are imported in the thousands out of Africa every year. They're treated horribly during transportation. They're not always in particularly good condition when they arrive, but then they're not worth anything as far as money goes. So they're kind of missold by general pet stores or even just people out to make a bit of quick money. And they're sold with the wrong information, because by the time we've told you that your £25–30 monitor needs like £1,000 worth of equipment and it's going to cost you 30 quid a week to feed it, and it can only eat bugs even when it's 4 feet long, people generally get a bit off put. So they've kind of attracted this misinformation so that people can continue to sell them easily, because you don't want them in your shop for long because they cost a lot to feed. So we've always been a big proponent for insect diets for monitors, and it's kind of come to light that no matter how many times you tell people it's important, they still eventually start to cut corners. So we have people go, oh well, I feed it mostly bugs with the occasional rat. It's like, stop with the rats. But people are like, oh well, he's so many years old, usually the number is about 3. He's 3 years old, he's had no problems. That doesn't make it okay. These animals should be living well into their teens, if not beyond. Most other monitors live into double figures, and some of them even into their 20s and 30s. Savannah monitors just don't do that. There's a big issue with females having issues during breeding. Males just get fat and it shortens their life by a long time. Average lifespan for captive Savannah monitors now is around 6 or 7. There's quite a few that are touching double figures now that we're sort of understanding what they need a bit better, but the diet is still the biggest complication that we have with them. The other problem then goes, people go, well, they need to eat hundreds of insects at a time, and that's not true either. We feed Elsie, Elsie's on a diet at the minute, so it's not quite the same for us yet. We're actually getting away with feeding her quite cheaply because she's on very small meals quite often to keep that metabolism going, to try and burn it off. But you'll hear people go, oh, well, he ate 200 locusts in a sitting. It's like, yeah. But because he will eat it doesn't mean he should eat it. I quite like triple burgers at Frankie and Benny's, but I probably shouldn't eat them every day. So when it comes to feeding these guys, it is expensive. There's no way around it. It is very expensive. It is labour intensive if you're breeding your own, especially with things like cockroaches. Some people breed their own Morio worms or super worms, depending on what you want to call them. And it becomes, you have several other pets alongside them. So you have hundreds of cockroaches, you have land snails, all these different things that people have tried to breed for them. It's not too bad for us as a shop, because obviously we can buy things at cost rather than at retail, so it doesn't quite add up as badly for us. Yet still we see a lot of shops cutting the corners and feeding them pinkies, fuzzies, anything up to small rats we've heard of. When you are feeding them, it's important. When they're young, they can eat an awful lot, and it almost seems never ending. You're feeding them pretty much every day on as much as they're going to eat, and you're talking boxes and boxes of crickets or bags of crickets. We try and mix it up with things like mealworms, Morios, waxworms, calciworms, cockroaches, all the different things that we can give them, but you are still talking an awfully big food bill by the end of each week. Once they become adult at around sort of 18 months, 2 years old, when they're fully mature, the food intake does drop, but you are still talking about large meals per meal. So you may only feed an adult Savannah monitor a couple of times a week, so every sort of 4 or 5 days. And in that feed, they might eat 100 locusts, or they might eat 100 crickets, or a scatter feed with with Morio worms, or something like that. But you are still talking about a lot of food per meal. Because they're only eating insects, it means that they're a very, very active feeder, and they're very movement oriented. So we often find that people say, oh well, my Savannah monitor is quite aggressive, and yeah, they should be. Savannah monitors really shouldn't be these cuddly pets that you see. Now, it's not to say that they can't become tame, but because of how they hunt for their food based on movement as well as smell with the forked tongue like every other monitor, it means that they're very keyed to movement. So Elsie at the minute, now that she's getting a bit healthier and a bit leaner, we now can't have keys near her because she tries to eat them, and she has had all of my keys a couple of times now. But it's also meant that because she's keyed into movement, we can exercise her while she's feeding, and we can get Locust on tongs and get her running and climbing. She climbed 4 breeze blocks the other day, which was quite impressive, and that kind of thing, to try and keep that activity with feeding. If we stuck a dish of Moreo worms in her viv, she'd eat the lot, whether there were 100 there, 500 grams there, whatever, she'd eat the lot, because there really is no filling these animals. But that's kind of the point with feeding them, is we don't want their meals to fill them. They should always be hungry, they should always be active and looking for food. That's not to say that you should underfeed a monitor or that you should keep them really scrawny, but it's been found that the body fat content of wild monitors is really, really low. It's something like 5 to 7% that they run on, and that's even egg-laying females and active mature males as well. So when we're sort of looking at feeding them, we kind of think, well, how do we balance that? Because we have to feed them, but if we underfeed them, they're going to become skinny. And what basically came to light through a lot of wild research is that these animals don't feed year round. So we should have breaks in the year. So in the wild, it would be when temperatures get a bit low, and that's what we call brumation. The animals then go into burrows or just into cover, and they simply don't eat for months at a time. And then when the rains come, it gets nice and warm again, nice and humid. The animals are active, they're eating the insects, they're laying their eggs. The males are obviously out mating and that kind of thing. And then the temperatures get a bit too hot for them through the day. So in order to avoid what would essentially be cooking, they then go underground again, become less active, they don't eat as much or at all. And that's then estivation, which is another process that we have to kind of bear in mind when we're keeping these animals in captivity. They will eat themselves into obesity. You can offer them food every hour, on the hour, they will eat the lot. And we then hear about, oh, well, they're not really chasing bugs anymore. And it's simply because they don't need to. Once the animal gets to a point where its body fat is so high, it just thinks, not bothered, I'm just going to sit here. If that locust walks past me, I'll eat it and top up. But we don't want that attitude in a captive monitor. We want them to be active, we want them to be aggressive, but food aggressive. You should be able to kind of shake a box of crickets at them and then know instantly that they're going to be fed and come running at you. To enforce those kind of periods of inactivity and captivity is quite complicated, and it's quite risky. It involves kind of turning off night heat, drying them out, which then runs risk of dehydration if they've not got the right substrate depth and this kind of thing. It's a very complicated process to explain to a pet keeper who just wants a really nice big lizard. So when we look at things like tegus that do hibernate, but they kind of sort it themselves, it doesn't have to be as enforced. So a tegu, as the weather gets cooler, will usually take itself off, become inactive. You can then lower those night temperatures and the animal will be absolutely fine, not eating for anywhere up to about 4 or 5 months. With the savannas, we have to be careful because we're running, with a healthy animal, we're running on such low fat reserves that we don't want to starve them out. They basically have evolved to kind of scrape through, is kind of the best way to describe it. These animals don't have access to a lot of food. They don't have access to a lot of active periods in the wild. They have to go with the seasons. So once we're done kind of explaining that system to people and trying to explain the methods that we'd use to sort of replicate brumation or estivation, it's very off-putting. And it means that then people think, oh, well, I'll do it next year, or I won't do it this year, or I'll do it later in the year. And then trying to fight the seasons is another problem that we see. So people trying to brumate their monitor in like March because they didn't do it in November when it's nice and easy because the night temperature in your house is cooler, even the day temperature in your house is cooler, and the monitor then picks up on these cooler temperatures, air pressure changes, all these different things that really kick them into these cycles that ultimately keep them alive long term. The kind of next major issue that we see with captive savanna monitors is they don't need UV. Now, if you've watched our UV video that we did the other week, you'll know that even things like leopard geckos benefit from UVB, and they're not classed as day active, mid-sun baskers. Savanna monitors are out when it is hot. And with that comes that they are sat in full sunlight in Africa, so the UV index that they're exposed to is astronomical. So what we would look, well, when her big enclosure is finished, she'll be under 14% T5 systems, and we'll be aiming for a UVI at basking at around 6, sort of 6.5, which is much higher than most of the species that we would be looking at. They can even go higher than that. I mean, some of the recorded UVIs in Africa are like 10, 11, 12, but the animals probably aren't active in those kind of levels because it would be too hot at the same time, and they tend to be taken during the time these animals are aestivating rather than during their active period, which sort of gets a little bit confusing for some people as well. They need UV. There is no if, and, or but about that one. These animals need high output UV bulbs. We see an awful lot of baby Savannahs sold in 48x18 vivs, compact UV or a mercury vapor in one area of the viv, and that simply isn't going to do it. They need that high output UV coupled with ridiculously high basking temperatures in order to keep that D3 cycle, like we discussed before, being able to be completed and allow the animal to assimilate calcium. Because they're only eating bugs, or because they should only be eating bugs, they're going to have calcium supplements in their diet along with a multivitamin. Arcadia Earth Pro 8, as we keep mentioning, is a fantastic product for that, along with things like Reptile without D3, because that's got the preformed vitamins in there, which is then another really important part to Savannah keeping, is to make sure that their diet is really varied, well supplemented, well supplied with calcium, because these little teeny tiny 4-inch long hatchlings at a year old might be 24 inches long. That's a lot of bone to build. That's a lot of bone to be building on limited calcium, because insects are essentially deficient in calcium. If we're not doing those supplements correctly alongside the correct diet and the correct UVB, we see MBD constantly in these animals, we see lethargy, we see dehydration, we see all kinds of problems that would be so easily fixed if people just considered these animals properly before buying them. I don't want this video to come across as me ranting on about how bad boscs have it in captivity, but there really isn't another angle to take this from. They are treated horrifically, they are sold horrifically, and even rescue centres that are trying to do their best and take them in properly still get it wrong because they haven't got the funding to keep these animals correctly. A major kind of link on from that is enclosure size. Now, because we're looking at such high output UVB, we need a particularly tall enclosure, so absolute minimum of 4 feet. That then allows deep substrate, which we'll get to in a second, but it means the UV tubes can still be mounted safely above the substrate to give the correct UVI without potentially oversupplying or being so high up that they're then undersupplied as well. The reason we use such a large enclosure is because these animals need to bask anywhere around sort of 55 up to about 65 degrees Celsius, which is about 150 Fahrenheit. They are surface temperatures. That's really important. They are not air temperatures. We are not trying to keep these animals in the oven. It's a surface temperature under the basking lamp, and that temperature needs to be provided in a space that is the entire size of the lizard. So Elsie will have a sort of 3.5 foot basking area in her new 9 foot viv. The reason we have to go 8 or 9 feet long is because by the time we've provided 3 feet of ridiculous heat, we then need a cool spot. Now, these animals live in very deep burrows in the wild. There are some fantastic videos online of finding these guys in like 10 foot deep burrows that they've dug themselves. And that's how these animals stay hydrated, and it's also how they avoid overheating or underheating in poor weather conditions or extreme weather conditions in summer. Without that length, we struggle to get either a basking spot the size of the animal, which then leads to things like circulatory problems. So if the animal can't heat all its hands up, they start to get shedding problems in their fingers because they're simply not warm enough. They get cold tails, they get cold bellies, that kind of thing. We have to make sure we're heating the full animal efficiently so that they can then warm themselves up to an active temperature, their metabolism then works properly, and that then leads on then to making them active enough to go and hunt the food that they need to be eating, etc, etc. If we don't use the same length, we either overheat the cool end or we underheat the warm end to try and compensate the fact. So the cool end wants to be down to sort of mid-20s, sort of 24 to 28 degrees Celsius is usually about right, which is about 80 Fahrenheit, 75, 80 Fahrenheit. That could be totally wrong, I'm really bad at conversions. And that then allows the animal to then take itself off and cool down if it doesn't need or want that kind of heat. In smaller tanks, like when we see hatchlings sold into 4-foot vivs, we have issues with that because the basking spot isn't as big as the animal. Even one bulb won't quite heat a 15-inch animal. And that then leads on to the same problems that we see in the adults, where they're not feeding properly, they're not active properly, and they're simply not getting what they need. Now, that's not to say that you have to pop your hatchling straight into an 844 and kind of lose your 4-inch lizard to the wilderness. They can be starting in something slightly smaller. We can achieve the same basking areas in sort of a 622, 633, but you're not going to have it in there for long, because once the animal's too big to have 1 or 2 heaters, it's then going to need that 8-foot viv straight away. We see people trying to sort of cut corners and go in smaller vivs. Oh, but I've used a slate to make it warmer. It's like, yes, you have, but at the same time, you're still overheating your cool end, or you're still not quite getting that high temperature on the surface on the basking surface. This then kind of leads on to the substrate. Now, one of the biggest things that people say about Savannah monitors, and it's in their name, is that they are from dry environments. Now, when we think Savannah, we think rolling grassland, kind of dry, no trees, all that kind of thing, because that's what, like on the Attenborough documentaries, that's where the wildebeest are and the zebra are. That's true, that is Savannah, but these guys are from wooded Savannah, or what would probably be more classed as like scrub and shrubland, that kind of thing. It's always quite well vegetated. Some of them are even found into proper forest areas as well. The humidity throughout most of their active period is between sort of 65 and 85%. These guys also dig burrows, and in much the same way as we see with leopard geckos, where we provide a humid hide to allow them to go in and out of high humidity, anywhere up to about 95-100%, we have to provide the same thing for the Savannah monitors. Now, in order to get a humid hide in a Savannah monitor enclosure, you're looking at building it a wooden box. So what people have found much easier is to provide them a really deep substrate that is always kept with the lower levels nice and moist. So as the animal digs down, it then has access to 80, 90, 100% humidity. This isn't just there to help them shed. As the animal is in there, it's also breathing in moist air, which is really important. These animals dehydrate really quickly, and a lot of it is when they're kept on either products like Eco-Earth, which I cannot stand for these guys. Eco-Earth is meant to have water added to it, so as it dries out, it actually begins to desiccate the animal as well, because it's trying to draw moisture. It's also very, very dusty as well, so it's no good for burrowing, because once it's dry, it just falls apart. But if it's constantly wet, it's wet rather than humid, whereas sand soil mixes can drain properly, so we don't have this stagnation and this build-up of moisture, but we can keep them nice and sort of claggy, for want of a better word, so that when the animal digs in there, it will hold that burrow. Another thing that people do for them as well is provide them with like plastic tubing that then leads to a burrow, so they can sort of feel like they've dug down when really it's all been provided for them. If they're not provided with this option to be super humid, we can see problems with respiratory infections, we can see mouth infections, but dehydration is the biggest one. You see so many Savannah monitors covered in dry, stuck shed, and Elsie's no different. She's come in with that, and it's hard to fix. We are spraying the hell out of her every day, and she's shedding-ish, but it's such a long process to try and get them rehydrated and keep that skin coming off properly. You'll also see a lot of Savannah monitors that look grey almost, when they really should be pink, green, blue, kind of all kinds of sandy colours. There's a strange salmon colour that comes through as well. They are absolutely stunning animals when they're hydrated, when they've shed properly, and when they're heated correctly and lit correctly as well. The other flip side to the substrate as well is it's been found that female Savannah monitors in the wild, when they are gravid, they dig burrows up to about 2 feet deep. So the kind of rule of having 20-24 inches of substrate comes from that as well. Because these animals are so difficult to sex accurately, it's important that they're given the option, unless you know you've got an adult male and you are 100% sure he's male, then people can get away with a little bit less substrate. But you're still talking about 15, 18, 20 inches of soil just to allow them that option to move, to keep that humidity gradient in there, because if we go lower, we're not going to have the same gradients in humidity. And it also means as well that you get a temperature gradient through your soil, not just throughout your tank. So it gives you kind of a double kind of backup to allow the animal to cool down from those really, really high basking temperatures. Females laying eggs in captivity are notoriously problematic. I've never bred Bosc monitors. I certainly, if I get eggs out of Elsie, I certainly won't be incubating them. but they apparently have problems where they will lay eggs and then within a few weeks the females tend to drop dead. I haven't seen an answer to why this is, but the chances are it will be something to do with captive care that we are still missing. Even after decades of keeping these animals incorrectly, we still don't really know exactly what these animals need. And I think that's the point that needs to come across with these more, is that we can advise as sellers exactly what to do with them, and we know full well we're still not hitting that mark. These animals aren't long lived even with the best of care. They still aren't doing the years that they should do. Breeding them is few and far between. There's a couple of guys that have done it now, and there's Liam Saville in the UK, and I believe he's sworn off ever doing it again, which is kind of testament enough to how it's really not worth it. And there's a chap called Dean Cheetham as well, and he's Cheetham, sorry if I've pronounced that wrong, and he's currently raising up his babies as well, and he's been quite public about how he's done it. I believe Liam was as well. So the information is there, but even they are reporting problems where females aren't doing well after. Now I know Dean's, I think, is still alive and she's still doing well, but we're still very short term. So obviously we're not going to know without years and years of doing it properly whether we've cracked this or not, or whether we are still missing some major part of their, like it could even be diet, or whether the temperatures are wrong, or the humidity's wrong, or there's some niche in the wild that they feel that we just aren't giving them in captivity. Things are getting better for them. Like I say, they've been bred, it's becoming more regular, they are living longer in captivity, and I think people are just becoming more honest about Savannah monitors. Sellers are really starting to push it out there now that these are not pet lizards. These are what you've classed more as a collector's lizard. You really have to love these monitors to give them what they need. I've always had a soft spot for Savs, but I've never wanted to stock them because, and it's going to sound awful, but I can't trust, after I've gone through all this information, told everyone how difficult everything is, and that they're not particularly going to have a nice animal at the end of it, I can't trust that that animal is going to continue to get that care for the sake of being tamer or being cheaper to feed and that kind of thing. Rescues are full of them. Shops get offered them now and then. I know Chaz at Snakes Adders took some in off someone, and they were overweight, but they weren't too bad, to be honest. They were quite decent. But it's, if the shops took the stand to stop selling them, then the wholesalers will stop importing them in as huge numbers, and then we might see a change. If these animals aren't as easily available as wild caught, we may then be able to look at captive breeding and have that as the sole supply. And we've had a bit of a moral kind of dilemma with it. We have a male that will be living with Elsie at some point. They've met, they got on quite well, they even tried mating, so it was a very quick introduction. And we debated whether or not it was worth incubating the eggs. Now, laying eggs in reptiles can make them lose weight, which is the main reason behind thinking, well, if we can get some weight off her by laying, that's a good start. Incubating the eggs is kind of in one way good because you are putting captive animals back into the market. Now, we probably wouldn't keep them in store if we did incubate them. We'd probably pass them on to a wholesaler so that if they're going to sell them, they're selling them from UK captive bred stock. My issue with that is that unless the price is ridiculously high, they will still get treated the same way by the same sellers as they were as wild caught. So I believe there was a chap in Europe who bred them and was selling for about €200 each, or €250, and he had a waiting list longer than his arm. But Europe is a very different market to the UK. Europeans have a long history of being very good with monitors, and Savs are no exception. Because of that, it's kind of, do we just bin the eggs? But if Elsie then has problems after laying these eggs, well, any eggs, she's not growing at the minute, after laying eggs, are we then just putting unnecessary stress on this animal for the sake of getting it to lose weight? And because there's then no continuation of population, we're kind of just going, well, we bred it, we've not added anything to the research, we've not added anything to the understanding of these animals, but she got thinner, kind of thing. And it's been quite a hard discussion to have, is over whether or not we should add to the problem, or do we then come across as if we are ignoring the problem by not contributing back when we have the opportunity to put captive bred animals out there. I don't know. We don't have to decide right now. Feel free to comment below and tell me what you think. But yeah, that's kind of the hardest thing with Elsie, is we're building her a 9-foot viv. Everything will be fine, heating and UV wise. I have no problem keeping this animal long term, especially seeing as we haven't had any actually appropriate setups put forward for rehoming. We've had a few that were close, but I listed what I wanted this animal to live in and no one came forward with that. So keeping her was no problem. We intend to use her as a bit of an educational tool in store. Obviously people are going to come and see her. She's fantastic. She wanders around the floor. She has exercise. The problem in here is our floor is quite cold, so she can only be out for 10-15 minutes at a time before we start feeling her feet get a little bit chilly or her belly starts to cool off a bit, and we don't want that. Once she's in the larger enclosure as well, she will have exercise in there. We're going to make it all branched out, and there's going to be burrows and all sorts of cool stuff. We will probably upload a video as well showing you that enclosure as inspiration for people that want to try and sort of up their game a little bit with Savs. So yeah, it's kind of, as a species, Savannah monitors they're almost tiring to deal with. People simply don't want to put the effort into these animals, and the people that do want to and have done have found breeding them so kind of stressful that they're not in a rush to do it again. It is very obvious that we are still missing part of these animals' captive husbandry. We still don't fully know exactly how to keep them healthy long term. I believe there's a couple that are in their teens now. I could be wrong there, but I'm sure I've seen on a few of the forums, and that's a good thing now, is the forums are actually becoming a good place to get advice about these animals. Savannah Monitor UK is very much bugs only, 844, humid soil, all that kind of stuff that we just talked about. But there are still, and unfortunately they tend to be American forums, where it's still feed them rodents, feed them fish. I don't know where the fish thing came from either. These animals aren't really found around water that often. They're not aquatic like things like your Nile monitors or your white-throat monitors that will sort of stick near water. But because they'll eat it, why not? There are even still forums that say it is fine to feed them cat food. And it is not. Just to completely dispel that myth, it is not good to feed these guys anything but insects and arthropods and invertebrates. Snails are a huge part of the diet as well. I didn't mention that earlier, but snails are a very, very good way to get calcium into these guys. Snails also make them think because they have to take the shell off and that kind of thing. So it's a good food for sort of keeping them mentally stimulated, which is kind of another big downside to them, is because they need such high humidity, such high temperatures to be active, and such high UV as well to stay sort of healthy. Having them roaming around a room is just not good for them. So we do it because she's in a small enclosure at the minute. It is not big enough for her. We have to get her moving somehow. Temperatures and humidity we're doing okay with. They're not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And that was kind of our thing with it, is we didn't want to have her here waiting to be rehomed for months and months and then be like, oh yeah, but we kept her in a 6-foot viv. So we've built the big viv, which will now house her permanently. And we will do videos about it. We'll update you on her and that kind of thing, as well as she loses weight. But yeah, I hope this has kind of helped dispel a few of the myths, especially around diet. Diet is the worst part for these guys. We may do a full Savannah Monitor Care video when the big enclosure is done and show you like how we've provided sort of what she needs. And even talk about like products that we'd recommend, and then talk about her diet and products that we would use for her, different live foods and what's good, what's bad, because there's kind of then the element of, if we only feed them Oreos, they still become overweight. So bugs aren't fixed to the obesity problem, but they're much better than rodents and chicks and that kind of thing. So yeah, we will do more updates on Elsie. I will come back to Savannah monitors at some point, but I really started to realise over the last 3 weeks since having her that people really don't understand these animals, and it's not their fault. It's a lot of the information is still very outdated. Savmon website is fantastic. It talks a lot about wild diets, a lot about wild research. There's some fantastic images on there that give you really good ideas of how these guys live in the wild. And Daniel Bennett as well, he's on a few of the forums, he posts his findings. He's probably pushed Savannah Monitor Care forward the most in the last 10 years, 15 years. I honestly don't know how long he's been doing this now, but he is kind of the be-all and end-all when it's come to wild information, because he's put the effort in to find out why these animals aren't thriving in captivity. Obviously, do your own research. If you are dead set on getting a Savannah monitor, and I can't put you off, or no one else can put you off, or you really do think that you can provide these animals what they need and you are interested in seeing these animals thrive, please rescue one. It is not often that I will push people to rescue as a kind of a first option, but these guys do not need to be bought. There are enough of them out there now that need homes. There's enough of them out there that are in awful condition and just need someone to pay. And that's all it comes down to, is to pay the money that they need investing in them for an appropriate enclosure, heating, lighting, substrate and diet. And that's what's missing, is the husbandry information, or as bare as we can get it, the husbandry information is there. People just aren't providing it, or people can't provide it because they're sort of misinformed early on. And for someone to then go, you need to spend £1,000 building an 844 with this heating, with this thermostat, with this UV, and that's a lot of money to find. And when you thought it was cool because it was £300 to begin with, you had a couple of years, and unfortunately it's not the animal's fault, it's not always the keeper's fault. It really comes down to kind of a shared responsibility in putting the information out there so that people can understand them, and sellers being honest, which is still not happening, or just sellers saying, look, we don't stock them, we won't stock them, and that's kind of why we want to keep Elsie's, to go, this right here is why you don't want a Savannah monitor. There are better options, tegus, ackies, freckled monitors, even not so much for personality, but even things like mangrove monitors, or some of the sort of smaller monitor species that are out there, things like roughnecks, not necessarily smaller, but they don't need these super specific requirements, and they can be fed a broader range of food than just live food, and it just makes life as a keeper much easier. And to be fair, it makes it more rewarding because you don't have the awful bit at the end where no matter what you provided them with, these animals still don't live full lives. They still don't get that kind of thriving status that something like a tegu at 15 years old would, or a big iguana at 35, 40 years old. They're just not built for captivity. But the information that we now have is now freely available. We just need people to start implementing it. If you do have any more questions about Savannah monitors, by all means message, comment, I will answer them all. But it really won't deviate from 844, 14% UV, halogen heat lamps to cover the entire body of the animal, and deep soil, and feed them insects only. There really are no corners to cut with these animals. They just need that level of care. So I hope you've enjoyed this little moan, because that's all it's really been. And I hope that any of you are keeping Savannah monitors find this sort of helpful, and that you do want to change, or if you need to change, and that it is helpful to have this information out there for people. And if you are keeping a Savannah in the way that we kind of know works now, all credit to you. It's not cheap, it's not enjoyable, and it's a real undertaking, and I think those people who have bred them deserve absolute credit, because it is not a simple process. I believe, I can't remember who it is, but one of the guys that's done it has done it more than once as well, and that is impressive. To get a female cycle twice to breeding is extra special. So yeah, I hope we do see an improvement. We'll see. Alright guys, well I shall see you soon. Bye bye.